The Jeffrey Epstein name is back in the news again today, but all for the wrong reasons. So on today's podcast, we're going to break that down for you. From the national feud concerning Aaron Rodgers and Jimmy Fallon, all the way down to Palm Beach, Florida, we're going to cover it. We're going to cover it in a way that others are not. This and more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show, and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome once again to another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. We're sure glad to have you aboard the Charlie train today. Thank you for being a listener. Whether you're a first-time listener or you're a seasoned listener who takes the program every week, we are indeed grateful to have you on board the Charlie Crime train. Hey, by the way, if you'd like to reach out with a shout-out, you can reach me, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the program, we're going over there to peacemakernetwork.com. Peacemakernetwork.com. There you become a badge, BADGE supporter, for just a few dollars a month. And hey, by the way, not only do you help support the program, you know what else? You get to help those brave men and women. I'm talking about the brave men and women law enforcement, first responders, and of course the military. I always describe them as those people that run into danger instead of away from danger. Your support not only helps our program, but it helps those wonderful brave heroes. So again, peacemakernetwork.com. And if you'd like to know more about other podcasts that we have available for you to listen to, go to charliecrimebuster.com. charliecrimebuster.com. There you will be able to find all kinds of podcasts that you might find of great interest to yourself. Now, I'm not going to make it hard for you. We'll make it easy for you. We're going to have a place for you to click on those links right in the show notes. That way, all you got to do is just reach out and click, and boy, you'll be there. Again, thank you for having us today inside your brain as you join the Charlie Crime train. Hey, I'm a poet and don't know it. Now, let's get to our focus. The name Jeffrey Epstein, along with Aaron Rodgers, Jimmy Kimmel, and even Bill Clinton, are in the news today, all associated with each other. And while that's getting a whole lot of play, well, the sad fact is that the real message that should be out there is not out there at all. You see, with this new publicity, we're missing the mark. Today, we're going to tell you the real tragedy of the Jeffrey Epstein story. And it's one that I gotta admit I'm not proud to broadcast about, especially considering my respect for the Justice Department. My friend, this is a case where justice failed in the most miserable manner. First, let's get some things out of the way that's covering up this tragedy, some static that's keeping us from listening to the real story that people should be listening to. Yes, there is an ongoing feud between the famous quarterback Aaron Rodgers and the comedian Jimmy Fallon. And the back and forth between the TV host and the quarterback, well, it goes all the way back to 2021. You see, that's when Kimmel criticized Rodgers for refusing to get the COVID-19 vaccine. He said he was immunized from the virus, but he did not take the vaccine. And Kimmel seemed to poke fun at him about that. He also poked fun at Rodgers after Rodgers suggested on some podcasts that the increased discussion over UFO sightings, well, that could be a distraction from Epstein's client lists. Now, here is a part that a lot of people do not know about this feud. You see, Kimmel also poked fun at Rodgers for Rodgers saying that there was even such a list. And in response to that, on another podcast, he said there is a list that's coming out, and a lot of people do not want that to happen, especially Jimmy Kimmel. Now, he mentioned, according to Rodgers, that Jimmy Kimball's name was mentioned because Jimmy Kimball had kidded him before or had made fun of him before that there wasn't such a list. But Kimball took that more seriously. He says that by Rogers mentioning that on a podcast, that he was linking Kimball to other pedophiles out there. Now, Rogers says the reason is because Kimball had been making fun of him about talking about the lists. But Kimball again, and others, took that to mean that Kimball maybe was one of those who had ties to Jeffrey Epstein. So now, there is Rogers saying he only mentioned Kimball because Kimball said there'd be no such list, but Kimball takes it to mean that it's associated with pedophiles. I really see both their points of view, but my friend, all of that's just static. Neither of these discussions should be the point of discussion about this case. The real victims, my friend, are the multitudes of minor girls that were molested, raped, and abused by this serial sex abuser, Jeffrey Epstein. And, what's even more tragic, he got away with it with a mere slap on the wrist. My friend, justice failed these women. And we're going to tell you how that happened. We're going to tell you about the real tragedy in this case in a moment. But right now, it's time for what we call our Crazy Crook story. Our Crazy Crook story today comes from the Peach State of Georgia. And while Georgia was defeated this past year by Alabama and missed the national championship, well, Crazy Crooks in Georgia, they just should not underestimate the challenges of robbing banks there. Because, my friend, this crazy crook that we're going to tell you about today, well, he was turned away from his crime with a very simple word. The word? No. You see, the attempted robbery of a bank in Georgia by a crazy crook, well, it did not go as planned, as one man's attempt at crime ended up being rejected by the bank's manager. Now, this unidentified suspect, by the way, our crazy crook today is on the run, so if you know anything about him, you're going to get an opportunity to turn him in. But the unidentified suspect recently walked into a Regions bank where he gave the manager a note that read, "Give me all your 20s, 50s, and 100s, quote, unquote. Now, usually in these situations, a teller is taught to comply with the demand. That way you can save lives and not take any risk. But this wasn't a teller. It happened to be a manager. A manager who maybe was having a bad day, or maybe he was just fed up with stupid people. Regardless, the manager took the note and wrote his own reply. In response to, "Give me all your 20s, 50s, and 100s, the manager wrote on the note, quote, "No, comma, you need to leave." And he gave it back to the suspect. That's according to authorities. Well, the suspect then lifted his jacket, gave the appearance that he had a gun. However, the manager said he did not see the suspect with a firearm. So then the manager asked the suspect to leave again. And this time, the subject obeyed. Well, authorities described the suspect as a 6-foot-tall man in his early 30s. And anyone who recognizes the suspect, well, they should call the authorities there in Georgia. So if you see this crazy crook or hear about it from somebody else there in the Peach State, please alert authorities. Tell them you found the quote-unquote say no bandit. And that, my friend, is Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. So now, let's get you up to date on what's happening in the Epstein's case. Jeffrey Edward Epstein, he was actually born back in January 20th, 1953. He was an American financier, and he's a sex offender. He was born and raised in New York City. He began his professional life by teaching at the Dalton School. Now, get this. This is kind of interesting. He was able somehow to teach at the Dalton School, even though he lacked a college degree. Now, after he was dismissed from the school in 1976, then he entered the banking and finance sector, working at Bear Stearns in various roles before starting his own firm. Now, there is a whole lot written about the life of Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was born, again, as I said, on January 20th, 1953. He was there in Brooklyn, which is a borough of New York City. His parents was Pauline and Paula, and they were Jewish and had got married in 1952, just shortly before his birth. Pauline, his mom, worked as a school aide, was a homemaker. Paula was a wonderful mother, homemaker, despite the fact that she had a full-time job. That's according to a former childhood friend of Epstein's. Now, the father, Seymour, he worked at a New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. He was a groundskeeper and gardener. Now, Jeffrey was the older of two siblings. He had a brother by the name of Mark. They grew up in a working-class neighborhood there in Seagate. By the way, it was a private gated community in Coney Island, Brooklyn. And he was referred to, Epstein, as Bear by his parents. Mark, well, he was known as Puggy. Neighbors described the Epstein family as being, quote, gentle, the most gentle people. Epstein, he did attend the local public schools. First, he attended public school 188, then the Mark Twain Junior High School nearby, and he would make money by tutoring classmates. People described him as generous, sweet, quiet, and nerdy. He was just an average boy, very smart in math, slightly overweight, freckles, always smiling. That's what a female friend said later. Now, in 1967, he actually attended the National Music Camp at the Center for the Arts. He began playing the piano when he was 5, regarded a talented musician by friends. Graduated in 1969 from La Follette High School, age 16. He skipped 2 grades, smart individual. Later that year, he attended math classes at Cooper Union, changed colleges in 1971, and he left without receiving a degree back in June of 1974. In 1974, again, as I said earlier, he was a physics and math teacher for teens, Dalton School, Upper East Side, Manhattan. Now, the headmaster was a guy by the name of Donald Barr. He served till 1974. He was known to have had several unconventional recruitments at the time, though it's somewhat unclear whether he had a direct role in hiring Epstein to teach without his college degree. 3 months, though, after Barr's departure, well, Epstein did begin to teach at the school, despite his lack of credentials. Now, he was known then as having a charismatic personality. He treated his students more like friends rather than their teacher. But he also, even all the way back then, showed inappropriate behavior toward underage female students at the time, paid them constant attention, even showed up at the parties where the young people were drinking. That's all according to a former student. Other students also saw him flirting with the female students. And Epstein eventually became acquainted with a guy by the name of Alan Greenberg. You've heard about him, chief executive officer of Bear Stearns. Now, Alan's son and daughter was attending the school there, and they pointed to a parent-teacher conference where Epstein influenced another Dalton parent to go to bat for him with Greensburg. So then, in June 1976, he was dismissed from there for poor performance. So Greenberg then offered him a job there at his financial institution, Bear Stearns. Now, I'm not going to bore you with more stuff about this serial sex abuser. He did have financial success from that point on, through banking, financial consulting, building relationships with the most wealthy people around. Epstein became rich, very, very rich, and very, very powerful. Perhaps it was this power that made him think that he could get away with anything, including the sexual abuse of minors. You see, Epstein, he developed an elite social circle, and he procured many women and children, whom he and his associates sexually abused. And many of these allegations was centering around Epstein's Palm Beach home. It was at 358 Elborough Way, which he bought in 1990. And there he would bring underage girls from Palm Beach County. And these girls would tell the investigators they were brought to his mansion in Palm Beach. Not only there, but they were also brought to his homes in New York and New Mexico and even the U.S. Virgin Islands. All of that was for sexual encounters. And then it was, my friend, in 2005, the police in Palm Beach, Florida, began to investigate Epstein. That was after a parent reported that he had sexually abused their 14-year-old daughter. Federal officials went on to identify 36 girls, some as young as 14 years of age, who Epstein had allegedly abused. Now, you know, it would have been great if we'd had a warning about this man, if he had been taken care of like he should have been taken care of with the Justice Department, then others may not have been abused. I want to tell you a little more about this and how it even gets worse for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein in a moment. But right now, we're going to take a moment to warn you about something that's happening right now, how you, too, could become a victim of scams. Here is our producer, James Buckland, to share with you about how these scams are operating today. He's going to share that, and then I'll be back with you with more of the story on Jeffrey Epstein and the real tragedy that happened. Here, my friend, is James Buckland.
Thank you, Charlie Crime Buster. This week we're going to be talking about some scams to look for in 2024. That's right, scams, fraud. Fraud is constantly evolving, from one year to the next, even from one day to the next. You see, fraudsters change their tactics in an attempt to steal hard-earned money from people like you, the innocents. Many times they deceive victims into thinking that the interaction is legitimate, and other times they prey on the unknowing to swindle and defraud them. In either case, the fraudsters employ very believable techniques, extremely believable techniques that make them very difficult to detect and to prevent. And unfortunately, folks, it's working. According to the Federal Trade Commission, consumers lost nearly $8.8 billion to scams, representing 30% increase from the previous year. Investment scams accounted for more than 40% of losses last year. That's $3.8 billion. The second highest reported loss amount came from imposter scams, with a total of $2.6 billion. And here's one of those to watch for in 2024. It's called the Authorized Push Payment Fraud, APP. And here's how it works. You see, APP has often been considered to only include payment transactions originated by consumers in one of the person-to-person payment channels. However, many industry experts now consider business email compromise, also known as BEC, to fall in the same category. In most APP fraud events, the fraudster has convinced the legitimate party to initiate a payment transaction using their user credentials. Now, while normally starting out with a phishing or smishing tactic, the fraud is validated through an email or a text between the fraudster and the customer. Or even hacked email accounts may instruct the customer to create a payment, change the account information on the payment, or to redirect a payroll deposit. But the end results funnels the money directly into the account controlled by the fraudster. And unfortunately, this technique is highly effective. And according to the IC3.gov website, it has resulted in over $42 billion in losses for legitimate businesses. Here's something to keep in mind. The same threat exists for consumers and individuals. Fraudsters may send a message asking for a donation to a charity or for helping escaping a dire situation. They may even ask for a payment in gift cards or over one of the faster payment transaction platforms. These scams may also take on the characteristics of a romance scam or an investment scam promising returns that are just too good to be. So be wary of a sudden influx of spam emails. Fraudsters use this method to obfuscate important security information and notifications once they have taken over the victim's email. So here's what you should do. We suggest that upon receipt of a request like this, follow the stop, call, confirm method to validate the request. That's stop your process, pick up the phone, and call the requester at a known number. Now, don't call the number in the email or the number that you received in the text. Just call the number that they give you. That is a valid known number. And then confirm that the request is legitimate. Again, confirm that the request is legitimate. Also, train your staff to recognize phishing attempts and create a culture of fraud awareness. Be safe.
Okay, now back to our main focus. In 2005, police in Palm Beach, Florida, they began to investigate Epstein. Again, that's after a parent reported that he had sexually abused her 14-year-old daughter. Now, new details has emerged now about that police investigation. New details even today in a recent report that has been released. It culminated with the notorious sex trafficker and his abuser reaching a wildly condemned sweetheart plea with Palm Beach prosecutors. You see, there's a second batch now of unsealed court documents that's been released this past Thursday after a U.S. judge ordered the filings of a lawsuit brought by the Epstein victims. The first batch of documents that was released will have unmasked dozens of names from the Epstein associates. It included Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, and even magician David Copperfield. Now, the naming of those individuals does not indicate any wrongdoing or indicate that they were involved in any of Epstein's crimes. Additional court documents were also unsealed. This time, they contain never-before-seen filings about his campaign of preying on underage girls, young, vulnerable women, including testimonies from the witnesses and victims themselves. The papers also contain details about a police investigation with the Palm Beach Police Department in the mid-2000s. And these documents, they raise fresh questions about the soft penalty that the pedophile got away with and the lack of any charges against his co-conspirator Maxwell at that time. In fact, in a June 2016 deposition, Palm Beach detective Joseph Ricari, the lead detective, by the way, on the mid-2000 case into Epstein, he testified that he had spoken, now get this, to 30 underage girls who all claimed that they were recruited by Epstein and Maxwell to come to his luxury mansion under the pretense now of performing massages. The detective went on to detail how Epstein and Maxwell procured the girls and then enlisted these victims to, in turn, recruit other young girls. Now, Miss Maxwell, during the research, was found to be Epstein's longtime friend. During these interviews, Miss Maxwell was involved in seeking the girls to perform massages and work at Epstein's home. That's what the detective said. When asked how many girls that he interviewed that were sought to give or that actually gave massages at Epstein's home, the detective said, hang on to your hat, I would say approximately 30 to 33 people. Now, of this roughly 30 girls, only one had really previous massage experience. That individual was older than the other girls. And then he was asked, were the majority of these girls you interviewed over or under the age of 18? And the detective says the majority was under. The detective then testified that each of these underage victims who went to Epstein's house were in turn asked to bring friends with them. The victims would then be paid for giving the massage and also paid for the recruitment of other victims. Now here, my friend, is where it really gets to the point. The detective went on to testify that the word quote-unquote massage was actually nothing more than a code for giving Epstein sexual gratification. You see, once inside the homes, the victims would then be led upstairs. The incident would begin with them massaging Epstein, but then he would sexually assault them. Epstein, according to this detective, would either attempt to fondle the girls or touch the girls inappropriately, and at one point he would masturbate. And when he was done, he would get up and go wash off while the girls would get dressed, go back downstairs, and get paid. So then the detective was asked, when did you determine the massage was actually a code word for something else? The detective says when they went to perform a massage, it was for sexual gratification. Now, this twisted saga started and could have ended with the public originally handing off the case to former Palm Beach County State Attorney Barry Kirchner. Now, the veteran prosecutor, he really set the stage for all this outrage because he crippled his own case more than a decade ago. That's what a Palm Beach Post investigation found. You see, here's the problem. These girls were molested. These girls were sexually preyed upon. But Kirchner, the attorney in those days, he acted as if Epstein's teenage accusers were prostitutes who eagerly sold their bodies to buy clothes at the mall instead of treating them like the high school girls who said they had been sexually assaulted by this man 4 decades their senior. You see, Kirshner, he decided he didn't believe him based on a review of the state attorney's investigative files. You see, here's the sad part. All these girls were sexually abused. Doesn't matter whether they paid them or didn't pay them. They were brought in, they were underage, and they were coerced to perform acts that they did not want to perform. That's like somebody going out and raping somebody and throwing $5 or $10 or $25 or $100 bill toward them. It still does not keep their crime from being as vicious as it is. You see, even no one from Kirshner's office, no one from that prosecutor's office even interviewed the girls or their parents. And his lead prosecutor, he declared more than once that there were, quote, no victims to the case. But finally, the attorney, Kirshner, he found a way to sink the case. You see, he took it to the grand jury, and there was only one victim that came and testified to that grand jury. It was the very first time that sex crimes were presented to a grand jury by his office. He decided to duck out of the responsibility, throw it over to the grand jury, and brought a half-hearted case to the grand jury that he probably realized the grand jury would reject. You see, 13 teens had already given police identical accounts of how this serial sex abuser used his wealth to exploit the girls. Yet the task of convincing the juries, well, it fell upon the shoulders of one little 14-year-old girl. And then even Kirshner's office undermined its own witness. The own witness who had told them that she had been fondled by the naked Epstein while she was giving him a massage. Well, the prosecutor peppered the girls with questions about their social media pages, about MySpace that was supplied to the prosecutors by Epstein's lawyers. Portrayed this young girl drinking liquor with boys, talking about sex. So unmoved then by their testimony, the grand jury gave up with just one charge, solicitation of prostitution. Same thing a John would face out there. Here is a little 14-year-old girl who's been abused, and they say it's a solicitation of prostitution. Well, no wonder the Post went ahead and filed a suit to get the transcript of these secret grand jury proceedings. That action was filed just recently. And that prosecutor way back there who had an opportunity to stop this serial sex abuser in his tracks, but instead soft-pedaled the case to the grand jury, well, he's now 75 years of age, and he remains tight-lipped about his handling of this case. Neither him or another prosecutor on Florida's West Coast responded to requests for comments. But, my friend, this is the state of Florida. And in August, Florida Governor DeSantis, he's ordered an investigation into how Palm Beach County authorities handled this case. Now, we all know that the 64-year-old Epstein killed himself in a Manhattan jail cell back in August while he was awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. But this investigation now means that Kirshner could be forced to finally explain why he did not prosecute this serial sexual abuser of minor children. You see, at the very beginning, though, this prosecutor was outraged by Epstein's behavior. In fact, he said to the Palm Beach police chief, quote, he said this is somebody we have to stop. But then, in 2005, well, one of his famous attorneys, swooped in. And this attorney had copies of the teens' MySpace pages. This Harvard law professor attorney, well, he seeded doubt about the girls' trustworthiness. The girls said on the pages that they drank, they hung out with boys, they said they liked marijuana. And, of course, the district attorney then, well, he thought the post on social media, well, he thought it destroyed the girls' credibility. But, my friend, the evidence against Epstein, it was mounting. The detective, he had 13 girls that described identical circumstances, right down to Epstein's pink and green couch, in which they were molested or sexually assaulted. That number of victims, well, it would later grow to more than 40. So as the case went on, well, the prosecutors, they stopped returning even the detectives' calls. They learned that the attorney had agreed to let Epstein plead guilty to felony aggravated assault and serve no jail time. The detective, who was enraged at that, he went on his own accord. He went ahead and put together an arrest warrant charging Epstein with 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. Those charges, my friend, would be punishable by a maximum 30 to 15-year sentence, respectively. But even though the detective put all that together, when he turned it over to the district attorney, it was all greeted with silence. So my friend, way back there in 2005, when the West Palm Beach Police Department investigated this case, this man could have been put behind bars for 30 to 35 years. But he wasn't. He was, though, put behind bars. But it became a glamour slammer. We're going to tell you all about that in the next edition of Charlie Crimebuster, as we talk about Jeffrey Epstein, the real tragedy, part 2. This is a tragedy, my friend, and people need to know about it. It wasn't the police department that dropped the ball, it was the prosecutor there in Palm Beach County. And then it grows beyond that, even to the fact that not only did local government let down these victims, but even the federal government got involved, and they too failed these victims. We're going to talk about that in part 2. Join us next week, same time, same station, same podcast, that is, for part 2, Jeffrey Epstein, the real tragedy. Until then, Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert, yep, for the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. If you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.